published author Professor Adekeye Adebajo, inviting you to the world where knowledge meets enlightenment and a place where history unfolds before your very eyes. His new book, titled Global Africa: Profiles in Courage, Creativity and Cruelty, unveils the untold stories of Africa's complex past and the extraordinary individuals who shaped its destiny. In this gripping narrative, he uncovers the courage of great African leaders, the brilliance of artistic visionaries, and the trials faced by communities. Professor Adekeye joins us now virtually to tell us more. Professor, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning.
It's an absolute pleasure, Professor, having you join us this morning. What inspired you to write Global Africa: Profiles in Courage, Creativity and Cruelty?
Well, the book represents the fruits of 3 decades of writing about the post-apartheid and post-Cold War era. So these are short essays that I've written over the last 30 years at various institutions. And the idea is basically to celebrate Africa and its diaspora, but also to see some of the flaws that have happened on the continent. So I've looked at racist figures as well as African autocrats as well. But most of it is a musical and sporting and intellectual celebration of Africa and its global diaspora in the Caribbean and the Americas as well as Europe.
Well, it certainly is years in the making, and I would imagine, a great deal of research went into it. So how did you research and select the profiles included in your book?
Well, these are essays that I've published. I'm a columnist for Business Day in South Africa. I also write for The Guardian of Nigeria and The Gleaner of Jamaica, so reaching that global Africa audience. But in addition, I've written for the Times Literary Supplement, for The Guardian of London, and for other wide-ranging publications like that, like the Johannesburg Review of Books. But typically, that has forced me to write on topical issues and also some of the most prominent and important figures in global Africa. And I have to say, I've also, of course, published 18 other books which have been based on deep research. So all of these have helped to put together these concise and comprehensive essays.
Now, Professor, you did mention racism and racists as some of the features in this book. But what are some of the most compelling stories or profiles featured in the book, and why?
I featured, for example, Cecil Rhodes in the book, and that's the first essay. Cecil Rhodes, of course, was the greatest imperialist of the Victorian era in the 19th century. Part of why is personal, because I happen to be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. And so I've always been intrigued by this idea of somebody who had so much influence as the former Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and was able to, on behalf of British imperialism, basically dominate so much of British Africa and introduce laws that were discriminatory and also dispossess Africans in South Africa and Zimbabwe of 3.5 million square meters of their own land. So those kind of figures have always been interesting. And then people like Thabo Mbeki and Kwame Nkrumah, interesting to see them as visionary philosopher kings as well. Figures like Mobutu Sese Seko and Idi Amin are African autocrats who basically spread death and destruction. It's also good to try to see what motivated figures like that. And then musical figures, Fela Kuti, the Nigerian, Afro jazz musician, and Bob Marley, the Jamaican reggae artist. And looking at sporting figures also, of course, football is incredibly popular in Africa. So looking at people like Pele, as well as people like Didier Drogba and Samuel Eto'o, and more recently, people like Mo Salah and Madio Sane. So it's a kind of ode and celebration to Africa and its global citizens.
As much as it is a celebration, of Africa and its heritage, Professor, I would imagine that when it comes to Africa, there's so much to write about. I mean, you can write volumes and volumes of book about Africa, and some of which includes the recolonization of the African continent and a new era of imperialism in Africa, the exploitation of Africa's natural resources for the benefit of Western nations, and while the African people remain poor. There's just so much to talk about when it comes to Africa. And then, how then do you hope your book will contribute to reshaping the narrative and understanding of Africa's history and, of course, its global impact?
Well, I also look at figures like two US presidents, for example, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, intellectual and charismatic leaders, but in the end, I see them as quite cynical in the way that, for example, the Rwanda genocide unfolded in 1994,
Yeah.
and Bill Clinton, as US president,
Right.
basically ensured there was no UN intervention. In fact, he forced the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping mission. And Barack Obama, of course, his father was from Kenya, but he militarized US Africa policy. And the situation we're seeing in Niger now with the coup, for example, you can trace that back to a $100 million military base that Barack Obama established by the time he left office by 2018. There are 1,100 US troops there. I'm not saying the coup was triggered by the US military base presence, but certainly the presence of US and French troops on the ground in Niger is part of what complicates the situation in this uranium and oil-rich country.
Absolutely.
So a lot of the essays there, looking at Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, the French president as well, and profiling him, a lot of these essays also deal with contemporary African issues like the scramble for Africa and Africa's quest for independence.
And what kind of insights or discoveries did you make during your research that surprised or even challenged your previous understanding of African history?
I mean, I guess the most important thing was the links between Africa and its diaspora. For example, we know about the 5 Pan-Africanist Congresses between 1919 and 1945, which helped the liberation of Africa and to create Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism was created not in Africa, but in the Americas and the Caribbean by figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Marcus Garvey, etc. So what was quite striking for me was how much the diaspora had helped fight for the decolonization of Africa and for the end of slavery. So, you know, fighting issues like King Leopold's brutality in the Congo, fighting Mussolini's occupation of Ethiopia, fighting the anti-apartheid struggle, all of those have diasporic links. So that was one of the things that was very striking for me.
And Professor, can you discuss any specific examples of how the profiles in your book showcase the resilience and ingenuity of African people?
Oh, yes. I mean, there are so many. People like Maya Angelou, for example,
Yes.
wrote about her own time in Ghana as an exile. And that was Nkrumah's Ghana that she was describing. And looking at the links and the efforts of people from America to actually contribute to the independence of Africa is something that I think was quite telling. Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian Nobel laureate, and the kind of fights that he has had in Nigeria against dictatorship and leaders like General Sani Abacha. I feature people like that. So there's lots throughout that shows African resilience and Africa's ability to stand up. Buchi Emecheta, for example, fought for the equality of women, the Nigerian writer. That's also part of what I have in there. Toni Morrison doing the same in the American context, the African American Nobel laureate. So there's lots of examples of female resilience and also African resilience as well.
All right, Professor, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts and your insights with us. We certainly hope that this will spark, a series of conversations about our rights as African people and what we should do in order to reclaim, reclaim our space, in the whole heritage. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.